When we think about the Nintendo Wii and its security, the first thought is how easy it is to hack. Copy a few files to the SD card, run an exploit, and literally in minutes you are up and running with the Homebrew channel and all the emulators and apps at your disposal. But initially, hacking the Wii was very difficult. After the GameCube, Nintendo learned a thing or two and stepped up their efforts to tighten security. The system was released in 2006, 1 year after the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. And with its much broader demographic, it was a smash hit, selling over 100 million units and still holding the sales record for the most consoles sold in a single month way back in 2009. The Wii was the successor to the Nintendo GameCube and was fully backward compatible with the GameCube on the RVL001 launch model, but the first revision, the RVL101 and then the RVL201, also known as the Wii Mini, had GameCube backward compatibility removed. The CPU inside the Wii was a 740MHz PowerPC chip known as Broadway, but this was just for all intents and purposes a PowerPC 750 chip. The GPU, codenamed Hollywood, was designed by ATI and runs at 240MHz. The Wii also has 88MB of total main memory, with 64MB of this as external GDDR3 RAM. The system has 512MB of built-in flash NAND memory and is also expandable via SD card, and of course contains a slot-loading disk drive which is compatible with Wii and GameCube discs, assuming that you have the backward compatible revision. At launch, the Wii was a target for hackers. After all, it's new hardware and has untapped potential. Its backward compatibility with the GameCube made that feature the first obvious weak point. The GameCube did not require code signing, so if code had managed to be installed into the GameCube's main memory, it could be easily executed with full privileges. The GameCube's disk drive could also easily be modified by setting it into debug mode and changing some drive settings to allow for backup and region-free games to boot. Now, the DVD drive found in the Nintendo Wii is very similar to the one in the GameCube. It's the same manufacturer, and the board itself, the controller board, is very similar. And because the Nintendo Wii has backward compatibility with GameCube games, it was the first area where hackers decided to focus their attention on. In theory, this same DVD debug hack found on the GameCube could be applied to the Nintendo Wii. It was first discovered by researchers Felix Domke and Michael Style in 2006, just a few weeks after the launch of the Nintendo Wii. But in practice, things were a little trickier than this. At the end of 2007, an early Wii hack was demonstrated by Felix Domke and security researcher Ben Beyer that allowed for homebrew on the system that ran outside of GameCube mode. This hack required extraction of the signing keys for the Wii, but there was no simple way to do this without hardware modification. This was still a very early work in progress and under research. It wasn't certain if this method would ever be released to the public. It was clear that Nintendo took many steps to tighten security on the Wii. The GameCube mode runs in its own sandbox, which means there is no access to any Wii features at all. This means no SD cards, no Wiimotes, no Wi-Fi, and no Bluetooth. So even if there was a way to boot homebrew, it would be confined to GameCube mode only. The earliest mod chips were released in 2007, known as the Wii Key. It took a similar approach to the Xbox 360 DVD firmware hacks at around the same time. The Wii's DVD drive was not encrypted at all, so a simple circuit to trick the drive into thinking that it was loading legitimate games would work, but this did not allow for any homebrew or unsigned code to run. Breaking into the Wii was going to be tough. Games were encrypted, signed, and identified by a unique title ID, and in order to decrypt these titles, a license key is required. Initially, snooping around to figure out where this key lived came up short. It was assumed to live in the NAND flash, but this turned out to be incorrect. During some investigations of a system update file on a Wii disk, it became apparent that the system update was not using PowerPC code at all. Rather, it was using ARM code. But how? Remember, the Wii is a PowerPC based device. It turns out that the Hollywood GPU chip houses an additional ARM9 processor that's used to handle I/O, security, and much more. This ARM9 processor was nicknamed Starlet by a security researcher who went by the name Sega. The master key used to decrypt game titles was unique to each console and was burned into the one-time programmable ROM or OTP at the manufacturing plant. The key lived inside the Starlet chip and there was no easy way to extract it. Oh, and the key can never be altered. In fact, the Wii's entire boot process does not touch any PowerPC code at all. The main PowerPC chip is completely inactive until the Wii's operating system known as iOS is loaded and ready to take user commands. iOS interacts with the Broadway only through high-level API calls, and there is never any direct access and everything is encrypted. iOS runs on internal SRAM and the Broadway PowerPC chip can't use this area, it's completely protected. This time around, Nintendo secured their hardware extremely well, or so they thought. I mentioned earlier that the earliest attacks on the Wii hardware was utilizing the GameCube sandbox mode. Now, there are a couple of discoveries that were made here, but ultimately they could run GameCube homebrew, but they were still confined in the sandbox itself. There was no easy way or no known way at the time to breach those perimeters and start accessing the Wii mode itself. But as it turns out, the GameCube mode was ultimately what caused the failure of the security system found in the Nintendo Wii. When you insert a GameCube disc into the Wii, it will first boot into Wii mode and then reboot into GameCube sandbox mode, and while it's in this mode, it allocates and uses the first 16 megabytes of the entire 64 megabytes of RAM known as MEM2, and of course iOS is completely disabled. The upper 48 megabytes is not readable because the Starlet chip protects against it. However, because the RAM is just external off-the-shelf GDDR3 memory chips with address and data lines, by using a pair of tweezers to set some pins low when they should have been high, exposed the upper 48 megabytes of data. But it gets better. By building memory dumping hardware that exploited the GameCube controller port circuit, the entire 64 megabytes of MEM2 could be dumped and examined. It turns out that the upper 48 megabytes of MEM2 was not cleared out while in GameCube mode and contained leftover code from iOS. So by using a pair of tweezers bridging points across different address lines on the chip, it was possible to slide the 16 megabytes of GameCube memory throughout the entire 64 megabytes of memory space, which exposed more of the leftover iOS code, and from here was easily able to reconstruct the entire iOS dump. And as an added bonus, when examining memory dumps, all the global and per console keys that were hidden away in the Starlet were discovered, there for the taking, including the one used to decrypt game titles. With a full iOS dump and access to keys, the researchers, who had now called themselves Team Tweezers, went into full swing examining iOS in great detail. The goal was to boot Linux on the Wii. However, even with the discovery of the keys, Nintendo must still approve all software that runs on the Wii itself. Before running any code, iOS checks the RSA1 signature against the SHA1 hash of the content itself, which is digitally signed by Nintendo, and execution will fail if there is no match. Nintendo's RSA implementation contained a critical flaw. They used the C string compare function that has the side effect of terminating when null is found. Nintendo was passing in byte values to the string compare, so in the event of null bytes found early in the hash, meant that brute forcing the SHA1 hash could be performed in minutes, and that in turn allowed for digital signatures to be easily faked. This meant that all software could be fake signed and installed on iOS that was not approved. But remember, Team Tweezer's motivation was to come up with a way to run Linux on the Wii. They could fake sign, but they still needed a method to install code on the Wii without resorting to modding, so they decided to look up save game exploits. Unlike the original Xbox, the Nintendo Wii digitally signed save files utilizing the console-specific key on the Wii. This meant that you couldn't tamper with the save files to hack them for, say, extra lives or unlimited energy. But since Team Tweezers had discovered all per console keys when they dumped iOS from MEM2, they were able to modify and re-sign any save game. They discovered a buffer overflow exploit in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. By modifying the save file and adding a small loader that would execute PowerPC Broadway code, it was easy enough to execute a custom loader. This was known as the Twilight hack, which was the first public way of enabling homebrew on the Wii without any modification to hardware. It was released in 2008, and it took Nintendo 2 revisions and around 12 months to ultimately patch the Twilight hack. These days, the Twilight hack is obsolete and no longer works in favor of newer and easier methods such as Banner Bomb. But if it wasn't for a single pair of tweezers and the brilliant work done by Team Tweezers, who now go by Fail Overflow, the Nintendo Wii may have stayed secure for a lot longer. So there you have it, guys. That's the story of how Team Tweezers, now known as Fail Overflow, managed to defeat security on the Nintendo Wii. It's a fascinating story to go back and revisit, and one that I really enjoyed researching and revisiting for you guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and I do have a lot of links to reference material below. I do suggest you check it out if you are interested in more information from a technical standpoint about how this hack had gone down, and the presentation that the Team Tweezers team had done at the CCC conference in 2008, I believe. So check that out. There's some really cool links that is really worth checking out if you want to know more about the history of Wii hacking on the Nintendo Wii. Well, guys, that will do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, you know what to do. Leave me a thumbs up. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.